I want to take you back to one of the most shocking, world-changing events that has happened in my lifetime. 2014, revolution in Ukraine. And in the middle of all that turmoil and unrest, these guys in unmarked camo show up out of nowhere in Crimea. Crimea, remember, is this big peninsula in the southern end of Ukraine in the Black Sea. Empires had been fighting over it for centuries. But modern times, it's always been part of Ukraine. Until, back to 2014, these guys showed up, turned out to be Russian special forces seizing control of the entire peninsula.
Russian troops moving swiftly to take control of military bases in Crimea.
Russia takes control of Crimea.
20,000 Russian soldiers have been on the move across Crimea,
which Vladimir Putin promptly claimed as now part of Russia. This was not something we thought happened anymore in the world. One country just stealing part of another, especially not in Europe. And Putin was shameless. He changed Russia's maps to include Crimea. He built a giant bridge connecting Crimea directly to Russia. He even visited personally, like this was some whistle-stop tour to just another Russian territory. And he's done everything he can to make Crimea feel like part of Russia. Russian shops, Russian currency, Russian TV. And it has been this way for 12 years. A whole generation has grown up in Crimea like this. Even in all the ups and downs of war between Russia and Ukraine, Moscow's control of this territory has felt unshakable. Something the world did not like, but couldn't change and maybe never would. Until a few weeks ago, something sort of impossible started happening. Something so huge that you can actually see it from space. This is NASA Worldview, and it takes new satellite photos of Earth every night. I picked February 9th, just random date, nothing special about it. Zoom in Crimea and notice how much light there is on just a normal day. It's 2.5 million people. But now, jump forward to June. It is a lot darker. The cities got dimmer, roads got dimmer, lots of areas in darkness. I tick forward again to July. It is like the Dark Ages all of a sudden. Check these out side by side. Crimea a few months ago versus today. This is crazy. It's like those photos of North and South Korea at night. What you're looking at in these satellite images is Ukraine doing the impossible. 12 years after losing Crimea, they're making a real move for it. They've already almost completely cut it off from Russia. Moscow's iron grip over this peninsula they've controlled for more than a decade is suddenly looking very shaky. And let me give you a little glimpse of what that looks like on the ground. Suddenly not such a stronghold, is it? Well, today we are going to answer how Ukraine is pulling off this huge tide-turning advance against bigger, richer, more powerful Russia. We're going to look at where the battle for Crimea is headed, what it means for the war that has already changed the course of the world, and we are going to ask, can Ukraine really retake Crimea? Okay, so we've got a map of the war up here. This is Ukraine here, this is Russia here, and this red area is the part of Ukraine that's under Russian control. See, there's Crimea, under Russian occupation. These lines move a little bit every day, but it's been basically like this for a few years now. And we are going to use this map to show Ukraine's assault in Crimea, how they're doing it, and how it is changing the larger war so we can answer what endgame is this pointed to? What direction we think this is ultimately going to take the war? And option one is that Ukraine will succeed in retaking Crimea. And then option two is that Ukraine will fail. Russia will hold on to Crimea. And if you've watched this channel before, you have probably already guessed what this extra empty space up here means. So yes, to give it away, it's going to turn out that these are not the only two possible endgames to Ukraine's big operation, and we will discover and fill in the remaining ones as we go. But first, let's look at what's actually happening on the ground in and around Crimea. Starting with this, a very important bridge, the Crimea Bridge, which Russia built in 2018 to connect its territory directly to Crimea. So see, there's Russia, there's Crimea, there's the Crimea Bridge. It is huge, 10 miles long, 4 highway lanes, 2 heavy rail lines. It's kind of an engineering marvel, honestly. Until 2022, this happened. Ukraine set off a truck bomb timed to blow up a passing train loaded with fuel, damaging the bridge so badly that Russia closed it permanently to heavy vehicles. Russia reopened it eventually to cars and train traffic, but not to stuff like trucks or tanks, which means that for Russia, what was supposed to be this multi-billion-dollar lifeline to keep Crimea supplied and defended is now mostly useless. which means Russia had to set up new routes to Crimea to replace that bridge. They set up 2, and the first one is the sea, a stream of ferries, cargo ships, and oil tankers, which cross here, just across this little strait, the Kerch Strait where this bridge is, or more often start up here by Rostov-on-Don, where Russia has a huge military headquarters, and then cross the Sea of Azov down to Crimea. And Russia's other big route that they set up, even bigger than the sea route, is this highway, this red line that's running from Rostov all the way down to Crimea. The Russians call it Novorossiya Highway. Novorossiya means New Russia, and it's Russia's old name for Ukraine when they controlled it in the 1700s and 1800s. Subtle, right? Anyway, they stuffed that highway with trucks, and they turn it into a 24/7 mainline artery into Crimea. And these 2 routes worked for years. Russia controls the seas, their navy is huge and Ukraine's is mostly gone. And this highway, you can see, is deep behind Russian-held lines. And both of these routes are protected by an invisible wall of Russian air defense. This is Russia's Pantsir air defense system. It's basically a big radar attached to a truck and a bunch of tiny missiles and machine guns that automatically and very quickly detect and shoot down anything in the air from miles away. And it is really, really good at knocking down drones quickly, efficiently, and cheaply, like this. And then on top of that, and really tying the whole defense system together, Russia has absolutely peppered this occupied territory with tiny little portable radars. But a lot of them are not what you're picturing. A lot of them look like this. Just a plain panel about the size of a suitcase, hidden on radio towers and on the tops of buildings. They tell Russia the moment Ukraine has a drone in the sky, so they can shoot it down, or jam the radio signal so it falls out of the sky, or send one of their own drones to just knock it down. All of which turns this whole red area into an invisible no man's land for Ukrainian drones. And those Russian drones also make it a no man's land for Ukrainian troops, too. So you look at this wall, and you think, how could Ukraine ever break through it to move on Crimea, which is all the way down here? But a couple of months ago, they found a way, starting with those little suitcase-shaped radars. Let me show you. This is from Ukraine's military. Normally I wouldn't use government material like this, but they're the only source for what I want to show you, and they're usually verified by independent analysts. Ukrainian drone teams have started hunting those radars all over Russian-held territory and blowing them up. This is a big deal. Each of these is like finding a needle in a haystack if each needle were protected by an infinite supply of Russian suicide drones. So how'd they do it? Well, Ukraine developed a few new tricks. One was learning that it would be impossible to ever actually completely beat Russia's air defense network. Like every time they knocked out one piece of it, Russia would just replace it. So instead, Ukraine focused on opening these little short-term avenues by knocking out everything in a specific area just long enough to flood drones through the other side. This is footage from drones Ukraine surged toward a frontline airfield where Russia kept a bunch of its own drones, which they promptly blew up. Russia probably replaced all those drones within a week, but this gave Ukraine time to then hit all the little radars in the area, which blinded Russia's air defenses, even if it was just in one little area for a few days. And there's another big change that Ukraine made, something that has changed this war and honestly might change all wars from now on. But before we get into what that is, I want to take a moment to thank today's sponsor. Sponsors are how we're able to do what we do and bring you videos like this one. So thank you to Cape. And if you don't know Cape, they are America's privacy-first mobile carrier. So here's the deal. We take it for granted that modern life requires a smartphone, and that having a smartphone means getting tracked all the time, having your data sold, endless spam texts, never feeling safe from being surveilled, and that's all just the cost of being a person in the digital era, right? Well, maybe not anymore. Signing up with Cape as your cell carrier means, among other privacy features, the identifier code on your SIM card automatically rotates every 24 hours so spammers and bad guys can't track you. Your call logs automatically delete every 24 hours too. And you get a primary phone number for daily use plus 2 secondary numbers dedicated for stuff like security codes and sign-up forms. And the last one I think really speaks to how Cape thinks about privacy. Think about how often you need to give out a phone number to set up a social media page, log into your bank account or whatever. And next thing you know, you're inundated with spam. Using Cape, you can keep all that public-facing stuff isolated on your secondary number so that your real primary phone number stays private between you and real human beings. It's a very elegant little solution to the problem of needing a phone to do anything, and it speaks to the level of care that Cape brings to its many other, more technical privacy features. Cape is offering our viewers 33% off your first 6 months. If you're interested, use the link in the description or code MaxFisher33 at checkout. Now, let's get back to our story. This is from a normal military trade expo in Washington, D.C. The big contractors show off their latest wares and rub shoulders with the senior brass who will decide what to buy in next year's budgetary cycle. New helicopters or tanks or whatever take years to develop and build, but then it takes years more when they finally get in the field for any feedback to trickle back up from the people who use it to the senior brass, who pass it on to the contractor, who then adjust in their next big shipment to match what's actually working or not working in the field. But this is how every military has done it forever. Centralized, top-down, slow, until now. This is Ukraine's version of the Military Trade Expo. Engineers from those suppliers embed directly with the troops and design stuff for their needs that moment. Individual frontline units even buy their own equipment, using a points-based web portal that lets them tweak and customize as they go based on what they need and what's working. This was maybe the big breakthrough that allowed Ukraine to start ripping holes in Russia's air defenses. See, for a long time, Ukraine's drone tech was evenly matched with Russia's and maybe even a little bit behind because Russia has so many more resources developed to R&D. But once Ukraine made this change, their forces started iterating each new design and improvement way faster than Russia could keep up. And once they could punch a hole in Russian radar, that let them punch a hole in Russian air defenses next. And this is exactly what Ukraine did all throughout June and July, absolutely hammering Russian air defenses, one after another. And they especially focused on two places. First was up here, this northern route up towards Moscow. This allowed them to start striking Moscow directly. And here, all this stretch from Rostov down to Crimea. And the second Ukraine opened up this airspace, they got to work targeting Ukrainian public enemy number one in the battle for Crimea: trucks. There are hours of footage like this. Each of these clips is the pilot's POV on a Ukrainian suicide drone, and you can see it is open season on the hundreds of Russian trucks keeping Crimea supplied. Oil tankers, military supplies, consumer goods, even tanks and military convoys aren't safe. Remember how Russia named this road the Novorossiya Highway? Well, Ukraine starts calling it the Highway of Death, and by late June, they are making that true. They are claiming 20 strikes a day, every day on this road. This is video from actually a Russian drone, and it shows something wild. Watch him zoom in on the road here. Those things on the road are Ukrainian drones just parked sitting there waiting for a truck or a tank to drive up so they can pop up and zap it. This is how fully Ukraine just owns parts of that highway now. So Russian occupation authorities closed the highway to civilians, and truck and military traffic dropped to a fraction of what it was. And there's one other thing that you need to know about this highway. There are a set of critical bridges just where the highway reaches Crimea. Or, well, there was a set of critical bridges here. Here's a Ukrainian drone strike on one of those bridges. Another. Here's a satellite view of what one of those bridges looks like now. This is the main bridge, way too damaged for heavy trucks or tanks. So Russia built this little pontoon, but it's just big enough for cars. And they're even digging out a dirt embankment to go part of the way. This is another cat and mouse thing. Russia's constantly building the bridges, Ukraine is constantly knocking them down, and Russia can usually keep at least one in working order, but this whole thing slows them way down. And remember, Russia did have this other big backup route, the sea. So what had been a lifeline of hundreds of trucks became a lifeline of hundreds of ferries, cargo ships, and oil tankers. It was like a reverse Dunkirk. Instead of evacuating Russian Kenneth Branagh and all of his friends, the goal of this emergency convoy is to keep them there on the shores of Crimea forever. So, I don't know, run the boats in reverse, I guess? Yes, I know Dunkirk was an actual historical event as well as a Christopher Nolan movie, but man, what a movie. Anyway, for a couple of weeks, it looks like the sea route was really going to work for Russia until this happened. This is, you guessed it, drone footage from the Sea of Azov. Look at all those ships headed to Crimea. Once Ukraine punched through, they were sitting ducks. Over the next 10 days, Ukraine sunk or disabled 147 Russian ships, some carrying tens of thousands of tons of oil. Here's a crazy video of a Ukrainian naval drone headed for an oil tanker while the crew tries to shoot it. It didn't work. Let me show you how quickly this shut down Russia's sea route to Crimea. This is a map of every ship in the Sea of Azov on June 30th, put together by a DC think tank. Lots of dots headed to Crimea, especially down here, and the point closest to Russia. But now jump ahead to July 11th, just 12 days later, almost no dots, except way up here between these two Russian ports. Other than that, it is a no man's land. Even this tiny crossing is nearly empty. Look at all these ships stuck in port. So that sea route, closed for business. But as if this was not bad enough for Russia, Ukraine was not done. Next up, and this is just in the last week or two, has been strikes all over Crimea itself. This is one of Crimea's main oil depots on fire from a Ukrainian drone strike. Here's another oil depot destroyed by Ukrainian drones. And here's a big Crimean power plant going up in flames. And this has been the focus of Ukrainian strikes in Crimea, actually, once they cleared out those air defenses. Fuel stores and power plants, which is kind of weird, right? Because how does this help them to retake Crimea? Because that's supposed to be the goal, right? And actually, come to think of it, there's something else strange here. These bridges Ukraine knocked out. If Ukraine has any ambition of liberating Crimea, they'll have to, physically get to it. Like, you cannot liberate a territory the size of Maryland by landing a couple of Home Depot drones on it. You have to put boots down, town by town, street by street, and Ukraine just went to extraordinary lengths to demolish the only viable route to do that. And if you ask Ukraine watchers or Ukrainian commanders about this seeming contradiction, as some reporters have done, they have a simple answer. Ukraine isn't trying to retake Crimea, not because they don't want it, but because it's just not possible right now. This red area, it is still a no man's land for the Ukrainians. Russia might be falling behind in the drone war, but they can still catch anything on land bigger than a dirt bike. And they've also got a couple thousand tanks in here. That pretty much rules out a Ukrainian victory parade onto the peninsula. So looking at our endgames here, we gotta rule this first one, retaking Crimea from Russia, pretty well out. But at the same time, I don't know that we can rule in that second option, Ukrainian failure, if only because Ukraine seems to have succeeded at every step of what they've tried to do in Crimea these past few weeks. Like, look at this board. This sure doesn't look like failure to me. I'm calling this one a no. So what all this points to is just what those Ukrainian analysts and commanders have been saying, which is that they're not trying to retake Crimea at all. All of this is aimed at accomplishing something else. And the first hint of what that is in what all those efforts targeting Crimea's fuel depots and power plants have been focused on bringing about, turning out the lights in Crimea. This is Crimea a couple of weeks ago. These cars are all lined up waiting for gas. Remember those satellite images we saw at the start of the video? Crimea has seen weeks of rolling blackouts, fuel shortages, grocery shortages, down phone service, internet outages, which didn't bring Ukraine any battlefield advances, but it did lead to this. This is from about a week after that last video. And this time, they're not lined up for gas. They're lined up to leave across what remains of the Crimea Bridge. Here's the view from that line the next night. You hear that sound? Those are Ukrainian drones overhead. See where they want to leave. So what's the goal here? Well, listen to this. This is Robert Brovdy, the commander of Ukraine's drone forces, speaking to a journalist named Kaylin Robertson.
Ми створюємо умови непереносимості хробаком перебування на півострові.
And he goes on to say that they are deliberately leaving this bridge, the Crimea Bridge, or what remains of the Crimea Bridge, mostly untouched, so that Russians on the peninsula can use it to leave, which a lot of them are. This is a former Ukrainian major general named Viktor Yahun, and he described the Crimea campaign like this. The main goal is not to capture territory at any cost, but to make its retention as difficult and expensive as possible for the enemy. Look, here's what you need to understand. This war is not a stalemate exactly, like these battle lines up here do move some still, but it's very unlikely that either side is ever going to be able to win outright. Like, look at how far the front is from Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital. The Russians are never going to get there. But at the same time, it doesn't seem like the Russians are going to give up and go home either. And this happens sometimes in war. Actually, most wars get to this state and therefore end in something called a negotiated settlement. a peace deal. If you watched our video on who won the Iran war, that's what happened there. Neither country surrendered, neither won outright, so they mutually agreed on terms to stop, at least for a bit. But because Iran ended the war, or at least that phase of the war, in a better position, they were able to force better terms at the bargaining table. And that's what wars like this tend to become. Both sides know that because they can't win, instead they will spend months or years fighting for better positioning, so they will get better terms when they negotiate the conflict's end. And this is why, for 10 years now, Russia has made such a big deal of solidifying its control of Crimea. Putin wanted to make his control of Crimea seem irreversible, so Ukraine would have to give up hopes of ever claiming it back in peace talks. And this kind of worked. For a long time now, the conventional wisdom in European capitals, in the US, among Ukraine's own allies, was that Ukraine, in order to ever achieve peace, would have to be pressured to accept the reality, however distasteful, that Crimea was never coming back and they were going to have to let Russia have it. But if you listen to Ukraine's leaders, this campaign, everything up here on the board, is meant, at least in part, to make Crimea contested territory again. And that is what the power outages and fuel shortages are meant to accomplish. For the last 10 years, every summer, Crimea has filled with Russian tourists, Russian families sent their kids to summer camp there. It has been literally normalized as effectively Russian. But shutting down that Novorossiya highway, which is how those tourists have gotten there every summer, even forcing a mass exodus of tourists in the middle of July, makes it feel a lot less normalized, a lot less incontrovertibly Russian. It makes it feel like contested territory. So we are calling this one a success, which means that Ukraine is going to be under less international pressure now to give Crimea up in peace talks. It's not some obvious gimme anymore. And at least, even if Ukraine does give Crimea up, which who knows, they might not, I'm not taking position on whether they should, but if they do, now that it's contested, they have leverage to at least force Putin to give them something back in return, because now Putin doesn't really control Crimea unless he has Ukraine's permission to control it. And if it comes to that, I have an idea of what that thing could be. The Donbass, this region up here. This is the other main chunk of Ukrainian territory that, for a stew of cultural historical reasons we don't need to get into, Putin is obsessed with getting Ukraine to give up permanently to become part of Russia. But Putin has a problem in Donbass, a set of strategically located towns here in the area he can't control, a region he's tried for years to control. And those towns are sometimes called the Fortress Belt. This is one of those towns, Slovyansk. It's been devastated by the war. It does not look great, but it is very, very hard for Russia to take, which they've been trying to do for years, which makes it hard for them to push past this line that they have been stuck at for years, unable to take all of Donbass. Hey, if you're still watching, you probably want to understand the world better, and so do the thousands of members of our club called New Press. New Press is where smart, curious people get a deeper version of what we do across our channels. In-depth interviews with the experts we speak to, conversations between creators, and the ability to connect directly with other members to talk about what's going on in the world. And right now, it's $60 a year to become a founding member. That money goes directly to supporting this work. You can check it out at newpress.com, or the link is in the description. Now, let's get back to it. Putin thought this war was going to topple Ukraine's government and turn the country into his puppet state. That has failed. So it seems like his bare minimum face-saving backup goal is to annex Crimea and Donbass and maybe some of this area connecting them. But he can't force Ukraine to give him Donbass if he doesn't even hold it. And he can't hold Donbass without these towns. And the thing that will decide whether he can take these towns, it might be Crimea. This is from a speech Putin gave in Moscow celebrating the 10th anniversary of annexing Crimea. I couldn't be there, I had plans that weekend. And he repeated a name for Crimea that he's used before.
Вспомнил о том, что Крым часто называют непотопляемым авианосцем.
The unsinkable aircraft carrier, one that would help him take Russia's other lost territory.
Что касается Новороссии, что касается Донбасса.
Since taking Crimea, Putin has turned it into one of Russia's major bases of operations in Ukraine alongside Rostov here. He's filled it with military airfields, missile launchers, lots of troops, and he's pushed in on Donbass from these two bases, Crimea and Rostov. Remember this guy, Robert Bravdi, the commander of Ukraine's drone forces? Well, he told Reuters recently that the aim is to deprive the Kremlin of the ability to use Crimea as a springboard for new offensive operations. Other Ukrainian leaders have said versions of this too, that the goal is less to cut off Crimea from this red area and more to cut off this red area from Crimea, to hold Donbass from further Russian advance by cutting them off from that Crimean aircraft carrier. And there's signs that this is already working. Crimea being cut off from resupply means that the Russians are less and less able to push north from it, and we have in fact seen Russia getting squeezed in Donbass as a result. So I am calling this one another success, at least so far. But there is one more goal here, maybe the most ambitious, short of actually retaking Crimea itself. This is Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky giving his nightly national address at the start of the Crimea campaign.
Ми не дозволяємо Росії використовувати наші землі як інструмент затягування війни і на перетворення окупації на безкінечну. Наша операція, зокрема щодо Криму, чітко прорахована. Ми оперативно забезпечимо умови, коли Росія буде змушена обрати мир.
Force Russia to choose peace. In other words, force Russia to end the war. For a lot of the war, Russia was seen as just inevitably on the advance, or at least so entrenched that it was going to be impossible to ever push them back. So Ukraine was coming under a lot of pressure from the Europeans, from the US, allies they rely on to fight the war, to accept Putin's terms and get out, end the war as soon as they could before their position got any worse. And that probably would have meant surrendering everything in red here. Putting Putin on the defensive in Crimea changes that. It changes perceptions of who has the momentum in the war. And this buys Ukraine time from its allies, who now see some chance of improving Ukraine's position and therefore a reason to fight on, a reason not to give up and accept Putin's terms. And this might not just be a matter of perception. This maybe genuinely does force Putin to change his calculus. Putin seems to have believed from the start that the longer he fought this war, the more his position would therefore improve, because Russia is bigger and it's stronger, it has more money, it has more people to force into military service. So his thinking, and you could see how he got here, was that every day he would gain more territory to insist on keeping forever, and he would gain more leverage in any eventual peace talks, which means that he had every belief that the longer he fought on, the better he was going to do, so he was never going to accept any peace deal unless it came with wildly lopsided favorable terms. But now Crimea, his crown jewel, his unsinkable aircraft carrier, is going from a source of strength to a vulnerability. He has to worry about protecting it. He has to worry about his hold on it eroding even further. And this gives him a big incentive to exit the war while he still more or less has a hold on it. And that doesn't just apply in Crimea. Ukraine is using its new ability to tear holes in Russia's air defenses to send suicide drones flying into all sorts of Russian cities, Russian infrastructure, bringing the war to them in a way that Ukraine has never been able to do until now. So, are we going to call this one down here another success? Well, I don't know. It might be early for that. The war has definitely reversed momentum in the last 6 weeks or so. Ukraine is winning now in a way that it hasn't maybe at any point in the conflict. But this war has been incredibly dynamic and unpredictable from the start. It is evolving so fast, technologically and strategically, that it's like an entirely new conflict every few months, which means that it could reverse momentum again. So I'm going to call this one, for now, an open question. But if Ukraine can keep this up, if it can keep Russia's defensive infrastructure broken down, if it can keep its lifelines to Crimea cut, then it will continue to push the pain and the onus of the war, which so far has fallen mostly on Ukraine, onto Russia itself, something that is very new in this conflict. And if it can maintain that, if it can keep that up, then it is really possible. I'm not saying it's assured, I'm not saying it's happening tomorrow or next week or even next month or even anytime this year, but they could really push Putin towards this, towards really taking steps to finally end the war.